trying to figure out Russia's next move and, how the EU can effectively respond, it can feel incredibly complex. Like you're constantly trying to grasp something that's just out of reach. So many layers.
Absolutely. And that's precisely what we're digging into today. We've got this really insightful piece from the EU Institute for Security Studies. It's a Chaillot paper called Unpowering Russia, how the EU can counter and undermine the Kremlin. Think of it as a potential sort of strategic roadmap.
Exactly, a roadmap. And this isn't just one person's view. It's a collection of expert analyses looking at this challenge from all sorts of angles. So for you listening, our goal today is really to cut through some of that complexity.
Yeah.
We want to pull out the core strategies, maybe those key aha moments that show how the EU might actually be able to, well, push back against the Kremlin's influence.
And right from the start, it's vital to recognize we're navigating a very tangled web here. International relationships, actions, there aren't really any easy solutions. But this report, it gives us a framework for understanding the EU's potential role in maybe shifting the dynamic.
Okay, so the report kicks off by just laying out the challenge, and it's much bigger than just the war in Ukraine, isn't it? It seems like this wider pattern of Russia actively working against the EU's fundamental interests.
That's right. The war is obviously a huge, devastating part of it. But the report also points to these ongoing malign influence campaigns targeting specific EU member states. And then there's this broader approach of global hybrid warfare that Russia uses.
Right.
And all this is happening while the global landscape is shifting, maybe less U.S. influence, and this real competition over, what's acceptable internationally.
So the old approach, just trying to be resilient and deter Russia, isn't really cutting it anymore. The EU needs to be more proactive.
Precisely. The authors argue for a kind of three-pronged strategy. Stronger resilience inside the EU itself? Sure. Improved deterrence, maybe looking at asymmetric responses, and crucially, actively working to diminish Russia's capacity to cause harm.
Diminish their capacity.
Yeah, this unpowering idea. It's about moving beyond just playing defense. Think of it like not just blocking punches, but making it harder for them to throw them in the first place.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting for me. The report actually challenges this image we sometimes get of Russia as this, overwhelming, unstoppable force. Can you break down those comparisons for us?
Well, what's fascinating here is the gap between perception and reality. Yeah. So in 2024, Russia's total economic output, its GDP, it was only about 1/7 the size of the EU's combined GDP, 1/7, and military personnel. The EU actually has more people in uniform, close to 2 million, compared to Russia's maybe 1.1 million. Even defense spending. If you adjust for purchasing power parity, what the money actually buys the EU's spending is about the same as Russia's, even with Russia's recent hikes.
So, okay, the aim isn't some unrealistic goal of totally disarming Russia. It's more strategic, limiting their ability to cause disruption.
Exactly that. The focus is on constraining those disruptive capabilities, weakening the tools Russia uses against the EU. And this starts, the report says, with a really balanced assessment. Look critically at Russia's supposed strengths, yes, but just as importantly, understand its vulnerabilities.
And the report makes it pretty clear the EU isn't operating in a vacuum here. There are other big global players involved, and, well, some of them are actually lending Russia a hand.
Right. This brings up a critical point about global partnerships. The EU will need to collaborate, obviously, with allies and partners where interests align. But the report really highlights that major players like China, and maybe to some extent the Trump administration more recently, are actively, empowering Russia.
Okay.
So a key strategic direction becomes identifying and maybe exploiting the weak links, the vulnerabilities within Russia's global network.
Let's really zone in on China for a moment then, because the report clearly flags Beijing as a pivotal factor in this whole equation.
Yeah, it's crucial. And what's fascinating is how multifaceted China's support is.
Right.
It's not just one thing. You see it in military capital, like a noticeable increase in joint military exercises, frequency, intensity, especially naval and air drills. It suggests, growing coordination.
And economically, China's really stepped in to fill some of the void left by EU sanctions, haven't they?
Precisely. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia trade has shot up significantly. It helps offset some of Russia's losses from the EU market. China's importing critical stuff, machinery, electronics. But, and this is key, it's an asymmetrical relationship.
How so?
Well, Russia is now way more dependent on Chinese imports, over 36%, whereas China's reliance on the Russian market, still pretty small, just over 3%. That asymmetry, That creates a potential point of leverage for the EU, maybe.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just trade figures and war games. There's a diplomatic angle, too, and even an informational one.
Correct. High-level visits, consistent support in places like the SKO and BRICS. China gives Russia significant diplomatic legitimacy on the world stage. And in the information space, yeah, they often amplify Russian narratives, especially about Ukraine. The report suggests a potential EU tactic here. Highlight China's own reliance on possibly flawed Russian intel.
So what specific strategies does the report suggest the EU could use to tackle this China factor?
It outlines several unilateral things the EU could do. Militarily, maybe threaten tighter controls on exporting arms or dual-use tech to China to stop re-exportation, maybe threaten to freeze exports back at 2021 levels.
Okay.
Economically, broaden investment restrictions, maybe more export controls in sectors where China really relies on European tech. It suggests a willingness to use that economic muscle.
Sounds like the EU needs to be prepared for a pretty firm stance. But the report also mentions that the Russia-China alignment isn't, like, absolute.
That's a really crucial observation. Despite the closer ties, they don't see eye to eye on everything. For instance, China has notably not recognized Russia's territorial claims in Ukraine.
Right.
And there are different strategic priorities. China seems hesitant about the power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline, for example. It suggests their energy policy is mainly driven by their own needs. These little differences, these could be areas for the EU to watch, maybe exploit subtly.
So this idea you sometimes hear about a reverse Nixon, the U.S. trying to drive a wedge between Russia and China, that's not really seen as viable.
The report basically sees that as unrealistic right now, for a few key reasons. The personal bond between Xi and Putin seems quite strong, and both get some legitimacy from this shared anti-American stance. Plus, Russia's growing dependence on China makes a sudden flip towards the U.S. highly unlikely, especially with, the perceived ups and downs of U.S. policy.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Another key region, the Indo-Pacific. The report says Russia's actively trying to strengthen partnerships there, too.
Yeah, what's interesting here is the main driver, trying to lessen the blow from Western sanctions and just hang on to some global influence now that they're more isolated in Europe. But, the report stresses, these efforts are really constrained by Russia's own economic limits and just the complex politics within the Indo-Pacific.
Military exports have always been a big tool for Russia in the Indo-Pacific, right?
Absolutely. Arms sales to places like India, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, that's been a cornerstone. But their dominance there is clearly waning. Especially in key markets like India, their share of arms imports has dropped significantly recently. So that traditional lever of influence seems to be weakening.
And diplomatically, what are they doing there?
Well, they've managed things like blocking the EU from getting observer status in the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, so they still have some diplomatic clout. And they do regular joint military drills with China in the region, signaling that alignment. Economically, we're seeing more Russian oil going to India and China, often using this so-called shadow fleet of tankers we might talk about later.
Right. So how does the EU effectively counter this? What's the strategy?
The report suggests the EU needs to position itself as the reliable, attractive alternative, based on stability, transparency, offering real value that actually matches local priorities. This means things like actively discouraging the laundering of energy money, offering expertise in renewables to help with energy transitions, and just maintaining consistent, meaningful diplomatic engagement. Show up, basically.
Okay, moving closer to home now. The southern Mediterranean. The report highlights Russia's goals there, countering so-called Western encirclement and trying to reassert itself as a global power.
That's the big picture ambition, yeah. Though, right now, those goals seem secondary to the war in Ukraine. The Southern Med is seen as a strategic gateway to Sub-Saharan Africa, where Russia, through outfits like Wagner, now maybe Africa Corps, has been involved in resource extraction, illicit trade, that sort of thing, plus big info campaigns in the region.
And military presence, what's their footprint like in the Med?
They see it as crucial for projecting power. They've reestablished their Mediterranean task force, talked about ambitions toward the Red Sea, Indian Ocean. But the report points to a potential hit to their influence in Syria, especially if Assad falls. They had to evacuate people, might lose access to Tartus and Haimim bases on the old terms. It shows the limits, maybe, of their power projection.
And their information efforts. Are RT Arabic and Sputnik getting traction there?
They do have a noticeable reach, yeah. And their narratives get amplified through partnerships with local media, social media presence. It definitely requires a concerted effort from the EU side to counter that.
So what are the specific EU strategies proposed for the Southern Med?
Key things include actively supporting the political process in Libya, maybe cooperating with Turkey there, using strategic communications really effectively to expose Russia's manipulative narratives, maybe highlighting where Russia seems to have ditched allies, like possibly Assad, cracking down on sanctions circumvention via the Shadow Fleet, and just maintaining EU unity on all this.
Okay, let's pivot to the Western Balkans. The report suggests Russia is actively working there to, well, stir the pot, exacerbate existing tensions.
That's the assessment, yeah. Their ongoing support for Serbia is a prime example. What's interesting is how public opinion varies wildly there. Mostly negative views of Russia in most countries, but much more favorable in Serbia. It really highlights the regional complexity.
But the report also hints Russia's strategic position there might be weakening. Why is that?
Exactly. It seems Russia's actions annexing Crimea, the full invasion of Ukraine, have led countries like Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia to reassess. They've increasingly aligned their foreign policy with the EU. Even Serbia, while keeping some arms trade with Russia, is also buying Western gear French jets, Thales radar. It suggests maybe a pragmatic shift.
And Russian disinformation in the Western Balkans, is it working?
The report suggests, actually, for the most part, it's had limited success in the majority of the region. Public sentiment is largely critical of Russia's actions in Ukraine, so maybe a degree of resilience there.
So EU priorities in the Western Balkans should be?
The report really emphasizes speeding up the EU integration process for countries genuinely committed to reform, make obstructionism costly for those who aren't, use coordinated sanctions if needed, engage directly with citizens to counter disinformation, and empower independent media.
Right. Let's move further south. Sub-Saharan Africa, another key area for Russian influence attempts. The report talks about their soft power approach.
Yes, their strategy there often involves diplomacy, education links, information outreach, frequently pushing this narrative of Russia as an anti-colonial power. Militarily, they've used groups like Wagner Africa Corps. Their actual effectiveness on the ground has faced more scrutiny lately, failures in places like Syria, Mozambique, Mali.
And economically, what's the scale of Russia's involvement in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Compared to the EU or China, it's relatively small, the trade volumes aren't huge. And the report points to this trend of African nations increasingly pushing back against exploitative mining deals from Russian companies. Also, a lot of the big promises Russia-made civil nuclear, mining deals, many haven't actually materialized or are seriously lagging. This gap between talk and action could be a vulnerability.
So what strategic actions should the EU take in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, actively debunk the propaganda. Highlight the unkept promises, the documented human rights abuses linked to Russian entities. Prioritize strategic investments in things people can see, service networks that benefit communities directly. Support African leadership in global bodies. Cooperate with other players like Turkey, India, the Gulf states, and really focus on job creation, infrastructure, through things like the Global Gateway Initiative.
Okay, let's talk hybrid warfare now. The report really stresses Russia's sophisticated mix, digital, economic, political, military tactics, all operating just below that threshold of conventional conflict.
That's a key feature of their playbook, absolutely. The big goals: undermine EU stability, weaken cohesion, drive wedges between members, distance the EU from partners like the US, and ultimately expand Russia's own influence. The report also highlights the hypocrisy, portraying themselves as challenging Western dominance while pursuing their own neo-imperial aims and breaking international law.
And the main tools they're using in this hybrid war against the EU.
It seemed to be dominated by cyber attacks and these complex information manipulation campaigns. The report gives some stark examples of the hypocrisy: condemning intervention while annexing Crimea and invading Ukraine, denying targeting civilians despite massive casualties in Chechnya, Syria, Ukraine, like the Sumy attack, denying atrocities like Bucha, despite overwhelming evidence.
So how should the EU strategically counter this complex hybrid threat?
The report emphasizes really beefing up institutional capacity. Things like psychological defense, better integrated threat analysis, getting better at anticipating threats before they hit. It also stresses holding social media platforms accountable for spreading disinformation, increasing defense budgets specifically to counter info manipulation, and maybe filling gaps left by discontinued partner programs like some US-side initiatives.
Right. And finally, the report digs into Russia's red line playbook, their use of threats to try and deter help for Ukraine.
Exactly. Russia's thrown out numerous red line threats since 2021. Now, they haven't always stopped support for Ukraine completely, but they've often caused delays, influenced what kind of aid was sent, and think about the debates around tanks, long-range missiles. Where they have been largely successful, though, is in preventing direct NATO troop involvement.
And the report suggests they'll likely keep using these tactics, especially if U.S. policy shifts. So how does the EU counter the red lines?
It proposes several key things. Actively call Russia's bluff through coordinated, confident strategic communications. Develop and communicate the EU's own credible deterrent threats, a kind of counter-red line playbook. This could involve threatening more major sanctions or asymmetric responses, and proactively build alliances to push back collectively against Russia's dangerous nuclear rhetoric.
Okay, one last critical piece. The shadow fleet of oil tankers. What's the story there?
This is basically Russia exploiting legal loopholes to keep exporting crude oil despite sanctions. They use ships under flags of convenience, often with dodgy insurance, hidden ownership, various smuggling tricks. And there's a worry this fleet could even be used to attack critical undersea infrastructure.
So it's helping them get vital oil money out, but it carries other big risks too.
Absolutely huge risks. There's a major environmental threat. We've seen accidents already in the Danish Strait, Sea of Azov, Baltic Sea, bad insurance, poor regulation. It's a recipe for potential ecological disasters with little accountability. Plus, the security risk deliberately cutting undersea cables is a real concern. But the report also flags a key Russian vulnerability. They really depend on that fossil fuel export money.
So what can the EU do about this shadow fleet? What are the recommendations?
The report calls for much more assertive policing of territorial waters, exclusive economic zones,
Yeah.
including stopping and searching vessels with inadequate insurance or clear environmental risks. It suggests shifting the burden of proof, make ship owners prove they're compliant, set up better info-sharing platforms like through the JEF, Joint Expeditionary Force, clear strategic messaging about the risks, and coordinated action regional, EU, NATO, all working together.
Wow, okay. That is a really comprehensive look at the potential EU strategies. So I guess to sort of bring it all together, the central message from our deep dive into this Unpowering Russia report is that the EU does have a significant range of tools and strategies they can push back against the Kremlin's influence.
Yes, exactly. But it really demands a coordinated, assertive, and crucially a nuanced approach. The EU needs that clear-eyed view of Russia's vulnerabilities as well as its strengths. The role of China, as we discussed, is absolutely pivotal, taking proactive, decisive steps against hybrid threats, disinformation. That's essential. And ultimately, a united, strategically aligned EU response. That has the potential to be a very powerful force.
And for you, the listener, as you've taken all this in, here's maybe a final thought to mull over. Given how deeply interconnected all these global challenges are, how can individual citizens and nations collectively contribute to building a more resilient, more secure European and international order when facing such complex, evolving threats? It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, and for those of you who want to really get into the weeds, explore the full analysis and all the detailed recommendations, we strongly encourage you to find and read the Unpowering Russia Chaillot Paper. It's published by the EU Institute for Security Studies, and it's a really valuable resource for a deeper understanding of everything we touched on today.